Hi, I'm Graham Robertson. Welcome to episode 21 of the TEESSIDE Band Archive Local Heroes Podcast. If you're a Teesside-based band or musician that would like to appear on a future podcast, please email tba1@gmx.com. That's tba1@gmx.com. Tonight's guest is a Teesside musician who has been making music since 1966. He's featured in several local bands either on keyboards or on lead vocals, and now records under the name of Fast Cakes, which he first used back in 1981. John Hodgson, welcome.
Welcome.
Okay, it's strange for the presenter of this highly acclaimed series to actually be the guest, but it would be even stranger to interview yourself. So I'm delighted to have been invited to do the interviewing role as a guest interviewer, so thanks for that.
Right.
So we'll get underway. The first question for you is, what was the first record you bought, and what features or attributes made you want to buy it?
I bought 3 records in my first outing.
Right.
I was given £1 by my mother, and I went to Leslie Brown's in Stockton, which some of the older listeners might remember.
Including me.
A top record shop.
Yeah.
And records were 6 and 8 in those days. That was exactly 3 for £1. And I bought The Last Time by the Rolling Stones, Tired of Waiting for You by the Kinks, and the third one was The Beatles, I Feel Fine. I suppose what inspired me to buy them was what was in the charts, and obviously they were the 3 biggest bands at the time, probably 1965.
Yeah.
And I just played them to death. I had one of those little dance set record players, and I can remember now in the front room playing those records and the B-sides as well, things like She's a Woman on the B-side, and just playing them till they were worn out. You know, as soon as I hear any of those tracks, I get taken back to 1965. So I suppose I bought them because they were in the charts, really. I was only 10.
Let's move on now. I'm interested that you started off on drums. So what sort of kit did you have?
I didn't really have a kit. We started practicing in the front room of my friend's house, Michael Charlton, who I was in a band called Purity in 1966. And we started out really, I was just banging upturned biscuit tins with wooden sticks from the fire. And we had a little reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he would sing, and he had this Krug guitar. It was an old Beatles Red Jet Electric. He would play that. I would bang on the drums. We both wail away, and that's really how I started. So I've never owned a proper drum kit, and I started out on drums, and I always fancied it. But I can keep a beat, but I've never really gone beyond the basics.
Okay, well, you've of course more well known as a keyboard player. So did you ever have any formal training on the piano?
No, again, I was all completely self-taught, and when you hear me play, you realise why. You can understand I haven't had any lessons. We had a piano in the house when I was little. I used to play on that, and then I actually bought one when I was about 13 or 14 for £2 off a friend, and I remember we dragged it across hundreds of yards of streets.
It reminds me of the Laurel and Hardy.
A little bit like that, yeah. And of course, as soon as I got home from school, I was straight in the front room and playing for 2 or 3 hours till I was called for tea. And I suppose that's the way I started learning chords and that, so yeah.
Well, that's a good way, because I often, in my experience, people who are formally trained become very rigid and depend on the sheet music and sometimes lack the ability to improvise. That's just my experience.
Well, it's a matter of having rules, and as far as chords go, I know obviously the basic chords and the advanced chords, but you like to think you can play chords that maybe a trained musician might think, well, that's not right.
Yeah.
But you say, well, if it sounds right, it's right. That's the main thing.
Okay, I think it's a good time now to start listening to some of your musical choices. So let's start firstly with one of your influence tracks. For people new to the show, each guest usually picks 3 tracks which have been an influence on them. And we're going to start off with John's first influence track. Would you like to tell us about this one?
Yeah, I've picked Elton John, Leave On, which is from the Madman Across the Water album. I could have picked any of a couple of 100 Elton John tracks, but there was a period this is when I first started playing the piano, and I had that piano in the house, early 70s, when he was massive. He was bringing an album out every 6 months. Tumbleweed Connection, Madman Across the Water, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road.
Yeah.
The Friends soundtrack, the Elton John album. I was buying all them when they came out, and his piano playing, his chords, he uses a lot of ninths and a lot of suspended chords, and I really like that. And Leave On has some lovely piano on it, of course. Madman Across the Water is a great album. So I thought I'd pick that to sort of show the influence on my keyboard playing, really.
Okay, let's move on to some more questions now. The first band, if I'm right, you were in was called Amanta Chubb.
Adamanta Chubb.
Adamanta Chubb. I do beg your
Everyone,
pardon.
I'll tell you what, whenever we were in the paper or in the local press, the amount of different spellings on that, it was about 20 different spellings. And we actually only had one mention on the radio, and he said Amanda Chubb, and he thought it was a girl's name.
Sorry.
It's Adamanta Chubb.
Adamanta Chubb, I stand corrected. Okay.
No
well, can you remember where your first gigs with that band were then?
Yeah, the first gig by Adamanta Chubb that I was involved in, they did have a couple before I joined, was at St. Joseph's Youth Club in Norton. I still think it's there.
I think you're right, yeah.
Down the back of the green. We were doing a youth disco, and it was like 5 pence to get in, and we were terrible. Absolutely. There was a support band called Mammoth who were worse than us. Sort of 3 young lads, about 13-year-olds. And of course we went on, and it was just a most almighty racket, really out of tune, and the singer was out of tune. But we thought it was great, and I mean, I just thought I was a rock star after that, the first gig. But that was we did 2 gigs at Joseph's, and we also played the Leelome Youth Club in Stockton.
Right, so that's a good grounding. Did you actually put your keyboard through a PA, or did you have your own keyboard amp at the time?
At the time, I think what I did was it went through the guitarist's amp. So there was me and the guitarist going through the same. We had a sort of a top and a cabinet, so it was quite a big thing. So we managed. It coped just about. But I had a Galanti 2041 organ, which I got from Hamilton's.
The old music store in Middlesbrough, yeah.
And Galanti 2041 is probably about the cheapest, nastiest organ anyone can think of. And I was trying to play like Deep Purple sort of organ with it, and it actually helped going through a sort of a distorted amp, because it helped beef the sound up. If it was too pure, it would have sounded like a church or something.
Yeah, so you got a more of a John Lord kind of.
I did eventually get a little combo.
Right.
But to start with, I was using the guitarist amp. Okay,
thanks for that, John. Perhaps now is a good time for your first Heroes track. Now, I'm not particularly familiar with any of these, but I've listened to them, and there's a certain quality about all of them, I have to say. But the first one is The Out, Who is Innocent.
Yes.
Just tell us briefly what about it influenced you in the heroic sense, as it were.
I thought about the Heroes tracks, and I was going to pick the obvious ones like Bowie and the Beatles and all that kind of thing. And I thought, well, I'll be a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more obscure and play some of the things that really knocked me out, but doesn't seem to have knocked many other people out. The first one is The Out, Who is Innocent. They're a Manchester band, sort of slightly post-punk, 1978-79. They were on the Rabid record label, the signed to Virgin, didn't do anything at all. But this track is just so powerful, and it's one of those lost tracks that should have been a massive hit, and when you hear it, it just knocks you between the eyes. And so I hope people hearing this for the first time might think, yeah, it's a real lost classic.
Before we move on to other things, just sticking with Adamanta Chubb, and I got it right that time, what was the largest or the best, most successful gig you did with them? Can you remember? Yeah,
I think the biggest gig that Adamanta Chubb played was at the Leelome Youth Club, which I've briefly mentioned before.
Yeah.
There was maybe a couple of hundred people there, and we were signed to do 2 45-minute sets. And after the first 45 minutes, we were doing really well. We thought we were doing well, and the manager came up to us and whispered in our ears, "You're not going to play the second half. I'm going to pay you off because people want to hear people want to hear the disco." So we actually kind of smashed our instruments up. We didn't really. I mean, the drummer kicked over the couple of drums, and the guitarist sort of swung the guitar around and placed it next to the amp, and I threw the microphone up in the air, and we tried to be like the Who, but we couldn't afford to smash the gear. So we pretended, we mimed smashing the gear up, and wandered off and got our 10 quid and went home. So, but that was probably the biggest audience, a couple hundred people. The problem was they all hated us.
Okay then, well, when Adamanta Chubb ceased to be, you joined the soul band Erection, which I regard as the first of your dramatic genre changes.
Yes.
How long did Erection last for, and how many gigs did you play with them?
the thing was Erection, it was about April 76, and Adamant and Chub were sort of falling apart because we lost our place to rehearse. We used to rehearse at Dimmer Blackwell's farm, and we got kicked out of there by his dad. And so we had nowhere to rehearse, so we were beginning to drift. And my mate Michael Charlton from Purity, my first band, he was mates with a gang in Middlesbrough, and they were called Contrast at the time. And they were sort of a multi-ethnic band, and they did a lot of old soul stuff and Afrobeat and that kind of stuff, Osibisa. And I was invited to do an audition. And I passed the audition, and as soon as I passed the audition, they changed the name from Contrast to Erection. And my old friend Yusuf Neymar was in that band, played congas, and he's on Facebook, so I'm sure he'll hear this. So I'll give him a name check. And we did last about 10 months, and we did about 80 gigs in 10 months.
That's pretty prolific.
Yeah, the thing was, the singer was, he had a snake, and he did a snake charming act. It was a little bit cabaret, to be honest. We played some serious gigs. We played a weekend at the Isle of Wight in the Birdcage disco. That was good. And we played some big sort of venues, nightclubs and things. But most of the gigs we did were sort of those social clubs around Concert and Darlington and that. Really sort of awful. We'd stop for the bingo.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
And the singer had a snake, and he also had a fire-eating act as well. Oh. And we all wore sort of sky blue satin suits and things, and it was all a bit cheesy, I suppose the word, but it was the mid 70s, and but the one thing it taught me was doing 70-80 gigs really quickly and having to perform and to present the music. The good thing, I was in the background playing keyboards, so I wasn't up front, and it really gave me an apprenticeship in performing,
which may have been handy for the next dramatic genre change. Which I can't imagine anybody else doing this, but you went actually from soul to punk in the form of Blitzkrieg Bop. Just tell us a little bit about Blitzkrieg Bop, if you would, please, John.
Well, it was, I remember writing in my diary in January 77, I'd bought a pile of punk singles from Hamilton's, and I was sort of saying I was disillusioned with Erection and the fact that we were playing soul, and I was really into this sort of heavy punk music. The Ramones album I bought as well, and it was knocking me out, and I thought, well, I don't like the music I'm playing. So I went to see Dimmer, who was in Adamant and Chub with me, and he was back at the barn, so he got back at his dad's barn, and I decided to join Dimmer and turn Adamant and Chub into a punk band. So we got Alan, the old drummer, back. Mick Sick was there already with Dimmer, so that was the classic lineup that when we started in February 77 was when we first started playing punk. And by June we decided to bring out our own record, and we brought out a single, Let's Go, and that sold, and we got a telegram from Lightning Records wanting to re-record the single, and it went from there, and we toured with Slaughter and the Dogs, and so we had a good couple of years where we were playing with bands like Generation X, Ultravox, X-Ray Specs, people like that, and we had a good time.
Sounds really good, and presume it's all over the UK that this took place.
Yeah, we played, we toured the UK with Slaughter and the Dogs and Eater. We played a few gigs in London as well, Hope and Anchor, The Marquee. We played in Newcastle, over at Liverpool at Eric's, Manchester's Rafters Club, Chester Smarties, Doncaster Outlook, Birmingham, Plymouth. We had a good little run. We didn't play abroad, which was, we nearly got a tour in France towards the end, but that fell through, so we never actually got to play abroad.
Right, one of the lineup was Anne Hodgson, who is now Anne Hall. Is she related in any way, or is it just coincidence?
Absolutely not related at all. I mean, going back to the start of Blitzkrieg Bop, Dimmer was going out with Anne's sister at the time, just for a short while, and Anne played guitar, and we needed an extra guitarist. Dimmer was playing a lot of lead, and with the punk we needed sort of quite a heavy sound, so we brought in Anne on rhythm guitar, and it was a great addition because, I mean, at those days females in punk bands was quite unusual. I mean, obviously this X-Ray Specs singer, Gay Advert from the Adverts, Blondie to an extent, although she's more new wave. Susie Sue, of course. Yeah. So that was quite a little bit of a, got us a lot of publicity having a female guitarist, and she was a great player, and good. Got some really good tracks with Anne playing, but no relation at all, just a coincidence. Yeah.
Well, she's now Anne Hall, of course.
Yes.
And people may have seen her playing bass, so there you are. Right. And a quick name drop for you there. If people haven't heard this particular podcast series before, what we often have is that the guests play some music of their own, and John's going to play a track now, I'll let John introduce it before he starts to play it.
Yeah, this is a song that I wrote back in 1985, and it was meant to be on the second album by Makaton Chat. We did the first album and we started writing the second one. It was a concept album about the fact that the Tories were in, and it was called Still Turning Blue. And one of the songs, which is actually about Margaret Thatcher, was called Radio Indifference. And I did a version on a cassette-only album in 1985. And so I brought that up to date, and I've done a keyboard version for this session. So this is Radio Indifference.
The sound travels as the crow flies, the birds cannon sit on the wire. The rush of fire ignores his words, he cannot hear for fear of silence. The sound of the freedom bell is trapped beneath the sea of lies. The cracked and dirty voice of liberty is finally broken. The fat cats do the can, the have-nots do the cannot. The ship of hope elopes to an island. The bald eagle glides in the distance. The sound of the freedom bell is trapped beneath a sea of lies. The cracked and dirty voice of liberty, it's finally broken. The Monty girl is harebrained. The lying maiden is locked in a tower. The speakers blare out, the riots flare up. The rich go to heaven and the truth goes to hell.
Okay, well, things were motoring for Blitzkrieg Bop, and I just wondered if you could outline, the single Let's Go, the process and the recording of it, how that went, how it came about.
Well, the initial one was, we were reading about all the bands were doing their own thing, bringing out records themselves rather than waiting for record companies to sign them up. So we decided to do that. So we found out a pressing plant in Newcastle called Morton Sound, got prices. I went along to the bank, put a suit on and got a bank loan. I managed to get a bank loan for £140, which paid for the 500 singles. And it's curious now that one copy of that single goes for twice that amount. You can go £200 to £300 for an original copy, and I bought the whole lot for 140 anyway. We recorded it in Dimmer's Farm. The good thing about having a rehearsal, and this was before nowadays there's a lot of rehearsal studios about. Back in those days, there wasn't so many about, and we were very lucky that Dimmer's father owned a farm. We had a number of outhouses which we kitted out, we soundproofed. We could leave our gear there 24/7, and we could practice anytime we want, as late as we want, because we're in the middle of a field. Can make that was a crude recording studio, and the drummer Alan Cornforth was very technically minded in that respect. He was a TV engineer, so he had a Heathkit 8x3 mixer, and we had 2 reel-to-reel TX, and so we did 2 passes really. We did a backing track with guitar, bass, drums, and then we did a overlay on that from one tape to another, very, very crude, with vocals and extra guitar, backing vocals on the second pass, and that would get mixed down. And we did the 3 tracks that way, and we went up to Newcastle with the tape in our hands. We went into Eldon Square, and we took the pictures that ended up on the cover in one of those photo booths. If you've seen the cover of Let's Go, there's a sort of a photo booth strip along the middle, and that was basically what we did. And then we went out the photo booth, walked around the corner, dropped the tape in at Morton Sound, and about a month later we got a big box of singles. So it was as simple as that, and that's how it started. But it was a very crude, very DIY sort of setup. No record company was involved. We ended up getting a really good review in the NME.
But I guess for new wave punk, you didn't want it to sound too precision and engineered and precise. And the raw energy needs to come across, doesn't it, to some extent? And maybe the DIY approach helped nurture that.
Well, the thing is, at the time we were thinking, it sounds pretty naff. And then when we went to re-record the Let's Go track for Lightning in a proper Berry Street 16-track studio with a London engineer, we wanted it to sound so much better, and we thought it sounded better at the time. But then maybe 10, 20 years later, I listened back to the tracks, and the lo-fi home recording is just so much more sincere. It's a more honest recording. And the Lightning one just sounds a little bit plastic, a little bit forced. So it's funny how you look back and you realise that the cheaper, crude recording is probably the one that stands the test of time.
Right. Okay, then. Let's move on to the second influence song now. This is a well-known band, very well-known band, Genesis, In the Cage.
Yeah, the reason I picked this was specifically for the synthesizer.
Right.
I mean, I love playing what I call fat lead lines, which are nice, sort of buzzing synth sounds and doing sort of running solos. I'm not very good at them, but I like to hear them and I like to try and play them. And the best exponent, as far as I'm concerned, is Tony Banks from Genesis. And this is one of my all-time favourite albums, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And this In the Cage features said synth solo that really sort of shows exactly what I like about synthesizers.
Well, let's share it with the rest of the listeners. Okay, Johnny, in 1978, Ray Radford was now your lead guitarist, and you toured extensively, as you mentioned, with Slaughter and the Dogs and so on. What were the positives and negative aspects of that tour?
The positives were that we didn't have to pay to get on the tour. Back in those days, it's probably the same now. If you wanted to get on a big name tour, not only did you not get paid, you actually had to pay, or the record company that owned you had to pay the headlining band to subsidise the tour, because tours were very expensive and they were loss making and they made the money on the records. So we actually got on for free, and we were third on the bill below Eater and Slaughter and the Dogs. And the good thing were, I suppose the highlight of the tour was the fact that we got to Sheffield Town Hall, one of the biggest gigs of the tour, and Slaughter and the Dogs couldn't make it. So it was basically Eater and us.
Right.
So we had a bit more of the limelight, and it was packed out, and we really played well. We had encores. I think that was the highlight. The lowlights were about a week later. We were driving round, realising gigs were getting cancelled. We were in Bournemouth, and we played Bournemouth, and we were supposed to play Portsmouth the next night, and then the manager said, the Portsmouth gig's off. And we thought, that's strange. So we drive up to Manchester, hanging around in a hotel. The Liverpool gig's off, that gig's off. And then all of a sudden, the whole tour just collapsed completely. And I mean, I found out much later, a lot of the reasons were for money and a lot of corruption in the management of Slaughter and the Dogs and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And we were stuck in Manchester with an unpaid hotel bill, a broken down transit van. The hotel manager seized our guitars for the bill, and we were just, and I'd given up my job. I had a perfectly good job in those days. If you worked, you didn't think about getting made redundant like now. And I had a perfectly good job. I gave up to go on tour, and about 2 weeks later I was without a job, no money, and the band seemed to be falling apart, and so that was the low light, was the fact that tour collapsed.
Okay, well, that didn't stop you carrying on with music, of course, because in 1979 you joined Bazax, a band many people associate with a certain Alan Savage, more frequently known as Sav. You described Bazax as a post-punk indie band with elements of Roxy Music, Bowie and Deaf School. Were they New Romantics before their time?
I really don't think so, because New Romantics were more, I think it was a little bit more flowery, a bit more makeup, a little bit more posing. We were quite down to earth, I mean, our live, we were more trench coats. I think we were more sort of a heavy Echo and the Bunnymen rather than anything to do with the New Romantics.
Yeah.
We had a sax player, which I suppose doesn't mean anything, but as far as...
Mr. Fogarty?
Yeah, Jeff Fogarty, great. I mean, but we were more... Sav was massively into Mark Bolan, Bowie, Lou Reed, the Velvets. And so, we'd do things like Waiting for the Man as encores, and we did Rebel Rebel as an encore. And we were quite heavy, I went through the whole of Bazax and never played a chord in all the time, because the only keyboard I had was a mono synthesizer.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Which was I didn't realise till afterwards that I never played a chord through the whole time I was in the band. It was all just single notes and melodies, which was great. It was a good a good exercise for me to actually to add to the song. I had to work out melodies to weave in and out of the singing. So I really enjoyed my time in Bass Axe, because again, after being in Blitzkrieg Bop and being the front man and being the focus of the gig, to actually stand at the back was quite a relief. You know, Sav was a great front man. He wrote most of the songs as well, to be truthful.
Right.
Which was one thing that I would have liked to have been a bit more, added a few more songs.
Yeah.
But I was glad to be taking a back seat and just playing the keyboards and getting on with it. But a great time in Bass Axe.
Also, at the same time, you actually set up your own record label and participated in other side projects that were called the Gynecologists.
Yeah.
So tell us about the Gynecologists.
Well, apart from being in the band, we also did fanzines as well. Gabba Gabba Hey, Teesside Smells, Street Level. There's a few like that, which we did. But I also decided to set up a record label called TEESSIDE. And I only ever had 4 releases. Black Rose's first single, heavy metal band, which again, that goes for 150 quid now. A band called Moulin Rouge did a single. And the Commercial Acrobats, which was Dimmer's band after he left Blitzkrieg Bop. He got a band together and we did a single with him. The 4th single was the Gynecologists, which is basically Stan Wells from Billingham. He's a poet. He still is a poet. He's a teacher. And again, I met him through a mutual friend, and I said, why don't we sort of like John Cooper Clarke kind of poetry with rock. So we decided to do something along those lines. He had a couple of tracks. So I was actually producing a session by a band called Tick Tick, and they released from that session a 6-track EP called The Immortalisation of Tick Tick. And we had about an hour left at the end of the session, and so I did 2 piano tracks with some very rudimentary bass guitar and a drum machine.
Right.
And then Stan, the poet, Stan Wells, did a couple of poems over the top. And that came the 4th single, which is called The Red Pullover, and that got re-released on Cherry Red on a compilation. And, you know, I was quite proud of that little single.
Good stuff. Okay, maybe it's time now for perhaps a second hero track. Now, this one, again, some people may say it's quite obscure, but this is Lucky Pierre and Idlewood. So tell us briefly what the heroic sort of influence was in this one.
Well, back in 78, 79, when this record came out, I was actually working at HMV in Stockton as the singles buyer.
Right.
And I was getting in all these American new wave punk things, Bad Brains and the Dead Kennedys, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And one of these singles was called the band was called Lucky Pierre, and the single was called Idlewood. And I just played it, and it just blew me away. It was just one of the best, most energetic new wave songs I've ever heard, and I cannot understand for the life of me why it isn't a huge song. It just seems so obscure. I mean, I've tried, it's not on Spotify. I've Googled it. I can't get it anywhere. Luckily, I managed to get in touch with the band, and they sent me a CD of the song, the B-side, and there was another couple of singles they did, and they put them on for me. So I've got like a little mini album of Lucky Pierre.
Lucky Pierre. Yeah.
But this is Idlewood. It's great.
Okay, let's just going back to this dual career with Bass Axe and the Gynecologists. Did you actually release any material by Bass Axe and Gynecologists from recordings that you made at TEESSIDE?
TEESSIDE was just a label. The thing with TEESSIDE is, I started it as a label, and then Dimmer set up a studio. This was about 1982, and I'd more or less finished with the label. I didn't have any plans to bring out any more releases. And Dimmer said to me, look, I'm setting up a studio. I want to call it TEESSIDE.
Yeah.
Do you have any objection? And I said, no, of course, go ahead. And of course, he set up TEESSIDE as a studio, which became much more, I think, well-known than my little label.
Right.
And then he brought out a series of compilation albums on the TEESSIDE label, now, which confuses people because it's got absolutely nothing to do with the TEESSIDE singles.
Yeah.
So, no, I mean, the TEESSIDE studio, I mean, I recorded at the TEESSIDE studio under various guises at various times over the years, but Bass Axe never recorded there, I don't think.
Right.
And they certainly never recorded at TEESSIDE and released anything from them sessions. No.
Okay. You know, when you're in Bass Axe, you did tour, you appeared on TV, and you released records.
Yeah.
But despite that, you decided you wanted to leave. So what prompted that decision?
Oh, the splitting of Bass Axe. Well, I mean, it's called, I suppose, well, even Sav calls it the classic lineup of Bass Axe, which was me, Alan Savage, Alan Cornforth, Jeff Fogarty and Mick Todd. And we had a call from Sav one day saying, look, we want Alan out of the band, the drummer. We want a different drummer. And I said, oh, I don't agree. If you kick Alan out, I'm leaving. And so I left. And of course, that was the end of that. And I got a call from Sav a couple of weeks later saying, do you want to be back in the band? And I said, no, because by that time, I'd got together with Alan and we'd actually joined another local band called Deja Vu.
Yep.
And we changed the name eventually of Deja Vu to Makaton Chat. Now, our first gig as Makaton Chat was at Newcastle Town Hall, supporting John Cooper Clarke, because I got a call from Newcastle Town Hall saying, are you in Bassax? And I went, well, no, we've split up. And he said, well, we've got a gig for Bassax at Newcastle Town Hall. I said, oh, we'll do it. So we kind of got that really by cheating, and we never looked back. We lasted for 6 years, but that the reason I left Bassax was they were kicking Alan out, and I didn't agree with it. And I mean, I fell out with Alan shortly afterwards,
Right.
So it was all a kind of a bit of a mess. But that's why I left Bassax.
Okay then. Well, maybe it's a good time to do the second of your songs. This one's actually called Hero for the Week. Just give us a brief introduction about it, if you would, John.
This is a song that I've been kicking around. I've got demos of it. I wrote it about 5 or 6 years ago. And the way I write songs quite often is I just sort of plonk away on the piano and sort of sing a load of gobbledygook. And I'd go da da da, and then eventually words would emerge, or the way you're phrasing a sequence of of words, and you would find. And Hero for the Week came out, and I don't know why, but I quite like that, Hero for the Week. So I wrote a lyric around that, and I've got a little piano demo of it. So I thought that's a nice simple song I can do as a sort of a one take without having to do loads of overdubs. So this is Hero for the Week.
Okay, go for it, John.
I know it's understood. You say that I'm no good. This making of your heart, I know it breaks apart. I can see you in the morning. I can hear you shout a warning. You know it's understood. You know that I'm no good. This making of your heart, I know it breaks apart. I turn and I see your face. I know that it's full of grace. You know I'm on the run. You know it can be done. There's trying to forget. There's trying to be better. I can see you in the sky. I can see you wonder why. You know it's hard to be a hero for the weak. I know you cannot see the woods for all the trees. Waking up is good. I know it's understood. To see you cry before I am to die.
Okay, so from 1986 onwards until probably 1994, you weren't actually gigging anymore, but you were still very active with regard to musical activity. From your notes, I think you concluded that fame had eluded you, unfortunately. So given that sort of new mindset, did you actually change the way that you approach songwriting and production? For example, did you decide to write what appealed to you rather than what you thought might be potentially successful?
Yeah, I got to 1986 and Makaton Chat split up. We'd done an album, we'd done 2 cassette albums as well. We toured. Well, we didn't tour. But we did lots of gigs, but we never really fulfilled our potential. And I got to 1986. I was 31 by that time, and of course, when I started out, I wanted to be a rock star and I wanted to be famous. And but by 31, I was married, children, and I realised that that wasn't going to happen. So I had to sort of reschedule my whole outlook on the way that I approached music. It wasn't no longer to be in a band and to try and be famous. It was just basically concentrate on the music and be a little bit more selfish. And so I went in the studio in '86 on my own for the first time and did a solo session. And from then on, I tried to develop home recording equipment, which of course was really expensive in those days. But I did have a crude 4-track, a little TEAC thing, and then eventually I had an 8-track. So from about '86 through the '90s, I more or less a singer-songwriter mode, as it were.
Yeah. From '86 to '94, essentially you were a home recording artist, as you've just explained.
Yeah.
You weren't really on the road. But then in 1994, you actually played a benefit gig. I think this is a very interesting story. Could you tell us the story behind it?
We got asked to play a benefit gig for a local musician and promoter called Dave Johns. He was very well known right from the mid-'70s onwards, booking bands, organising gigs in the Middlesbrough area. Yeah. He was also in several bands called the Barbarians mainly, and ICI was a later sort of lineup that he was in. But he was very well liked. He was a really nice chap. Unfortunately, by 1994, he had cancer. He was terminally ill. He had weeks to live. And the singer out of the Barbarians, Fran Mickner, decided to have a benefit at Middlesbrough Town Hall and raise funds for what would be his widow. So they decided to get all the old bands from the punk days back together again. The problem was, most of them weren't speaking to each other. So we went on as Blitzkrieg Bop, although there was 2 members out of the 5 on stage who were actually original members. There was Shoot the Lights Out, came together. Again, that was only 1 original member. The Commercial Acrobats played. Again, I think there was 3 out of 4 were original members. No Way played as well.
Right.
And the Wildcats of Kilkenny played, and I think they're still going strong now.
Certainly are, yeah.
And there was a video made of the evening, and that was brought out on proper VHS release.
Yeah. And
it was a really good night, and I think we raised over £2,000.
Wow.
And Dave Johns was actually present at the gig in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
Sadly, he died about a week after the gig. So that was a very mixed up time. It was a real good gig and everything, but it was sad because of the reason we were doing it.
Yeah.
But that was interesting. Good doing that. We did a little short 3-song set.
Yeah. Okay. Well, between 1988 and 1999, the spirit of Blitzkrieg Bop was rekindled in more ways than one. So what part did you play in that sort of renaissance?
Well, it never really went away. Blitzkrieg Bop tracks kept turning up on compilation albums, and we got bootlegged, and there was all sorts of things going on, and it never really sort of went away. And so we got to 1999, and it was the 20th anniversary of us splitting up in 1979. So I decided to do a reunion gig at the Corner House in Middlesbrough, and we got 4 original members. The only one we couldn't get was Alan on drums because we weren't really speaking, but so we got Spider, who was from The Lice, another local punk band.
Oh yeah, I've seen Spider many times recently.
Yeah, he's a good lad, and he plays all over the place,
yeah,
and he's a great drummer, and he slotted right in, and we had a couple of rehearsals at Studio 64, and then we played at the Corner House, and it was a great gig. We had it videoed, and it was recorded as well. It got bootlegged. It came out in Spain as a bootleg live at the Corner House, which annoyed me a little bit. But I'll plug it now. Some of the tracks from that gig and some of the earlier tracks from '77 are coming out on a live CD called 77 and Beyond Blitzkrieg Bop Live. 27 tracks. That'll be coming out later this year. So
Right.
that's something to listen out for.
Okay, well, we'll do, yeah. Now's probably a good time to do the final influence track of yours. This particular one is a certain Brian Eno, who people would have first recognised as being an integral part of Roxy Music. And this has the curious title of Dead Finks Don't Talk. So a brief explanation as to why you picked this, John, if you will.
Okay. Yeah, this is from Eno's first album, a solo album called Here Come the Warm Jets from 73. The thing is, on that album, there's a track called Blank Frank, which is where I took my stage name for Blitzkrieg Bop.
All right.
And also, there's a song called Dead Finks Don't Talk. What I like about Eno is the way that he sings. He sings in this quite often in this posh English accent.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I'm afraid I lapse into that quite often. And Dead Finks Don't Talk really is a good example of the way that he sings in this sort of posh accent. And I find it very appealing.
Well, here it comes now. Well, the 21st century marked the acquisition of a new home studio setup for you, John. Can you give us a brief outline of the setup and what it's capable of?
Well, I suppose it's capable of anything, really. I decided to really splash out and get a proper setup because I was sick of sort of scrabbling around. And I had to make the decision of either getting a computer setup, which is things like Pro Tools and all that kind of stuff, Cubase. And whenever I'd tried them in the past, I just really struggled with using them. It really sort of confused me, and I wasn't very confident.
Well, you wouldn't be the only one.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Whenever I get a book, like an instruction book, I get to page 6, and I get past the thing where you have to use the plug correctly and make sure you don't spill water on it and things. You get to the bit where it actually used this thing, and it seems to go into a foreign language. So I decided to buy one of these separate digital recorders. It's a 24 track.
Right.
It's a Roland VS2480, and I've managed to master it. I mean, I'm still only using about 10% of its power. There's all sorts of things that I don't really understand.
Well, there always is with any kind of recording setup, isn't there?
Yeah, so alongside that, instead of having to use software effects, I had to use external hardware. So I've got a rack of old school effects like an Alesis microverb and Behringer stuff. And then I started acquiring keyboards, and I've got about 23 now. So I mean, I got a really good keyboard to start with when I set it up. I got a Phantom X8.
Yeah.
And so that basically gives me all the sounds I want, and I got obviously a Boss drum machine. So basically, I can use this anytime I want. It doesn't cost a penny. You're not paying studio fees. The problem is, you get something like this, and because it's on your doorstep and it's free, you tend not to use it. Like you used to really look forward to going to the studio and be very precious with the time. Yeah. Now that you've got it anytime you want, you kind of ignore it a little bit and sort of say, I'll do it tomorrow. I don't have to do it today. So, but yeah, I really enjoy having the studio.
And I guess it's been future-proof in many respects because it still does everything you probably want 10 years on.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, about 6 months after I bought it, they suddenly decided to stop making it and supporting it. And it suddenly ceased to be featured in Sound on Sound magazine. I mean, Sound on Sound magazine, I look at it now, there's very little in there for me that I can relate to. I mean, there's things about production and things, but unfortunately, because it's not mentioned regularly as computer kind of music setup, so I'm afraid I'm on my own, really.
Okay. Well, this setup that we just talked about allowed you to record a solo album called Live Young Die Fast under the name of Fast Cakes, which is the name you're appearing as tonight. A bit of information about the instruments that you used in the recording process. You've mentioned the keyboards and so on, but just be interested to know about the diversity and types of instruments you used and effects.
I was very conscious of the fact that I can't play guitar, really. So when I decided to actually put an album together and get it pressed up and everything, I was worried about it sounding a little bit samey. So I was lucky in the fact that I had a friend in Canada who played some nice guitar. He sent me a couple of pieces that I used as sort of parts of songs, and I played some very crude guitar myself. Apart from that, it's mainly keyboards, but the fact that a Phantom X8 is so versatile, it can sound like a guitar. So there's quite a variety of sounds, and I use percussion as well, and obviously the voice. So I like to think that the finished album sounds a little bit more variety than maybe you would think, being mostly keyboards.
So how many copies did it sell?
Well, the reason, I got 1,000 pressed.
Right.
And the reason was that it was basically financial. It made the unit cost about 72 pence.
Yeah.
Where if I'd got 500 done, you're looking at maybe 150 each.
Oh, yeah, it's always the...
It's always the thing. You get the extra ones pressed. I sold about 450.
Well, that's not to be sneezed at.
Which is not too bad.
Yeah.
I've still got a few left. Everybody who visits the house gets one, whether they like it or not. But, it's there, it's done, it's sold. And I got a couple of reviews, nothing major, really. It was so hard to get a review nowadays.
Yeah. Okay, John, well, maybe now is a good time to play your third and final Heroes track. This one's called Andy White, and it's 1,000,000 Miles.
Yeah, Andy White was... the first time I saw him was on the Old Grey Whistle test about 1980.
Yeah.
And he was just him with a guitar and a TEAC 4-track behind him with some kind of rhythm on it.
Yeah.
And he did this kind of John Cooper Clarke-ish poetry, half-spoken thing. He's an Irish guy. He's still going strong. He's touring. I went to see him a couple of years ago at a club in Leeds, and he's a really, really good songwriter. He's making a living out of it. He's touring the world, but not many people know him. But he was signed to Decca in those days, and he did 2 or 3 albums on Decca. The thing I like about this song, I'm big into nostalgia and looking back. I know people say you shouldn't look back, but I love looking back. And this song is very wistful, and it's got a lot of minor chords and sevenths. And when you listen to it, it makes you listen to the lyrics. It's about love lost and that kind of thing. I really like its sentiment, and I never tire of hearing it.
Okay, here it comes now. Okay then, just sort of bringing us almost up to the present date, you participated in the Bazak's reunion album, and you also released a second Fast Cakes album called Call Off the Dogs, and my particular favourite track on that is called Murder in the Park.
Yeah.
How can people get hold of Call Off the Dogs? Because I think there's a lot of good stuff in there worthy of attention.
I would say that, wouldn't I? But I really am proud of that album, and I think it's got some of my strongest stuff on. Where you can get it, it's on Spotify, it's on iTunes, it's on CD Baby. I'm afraid I didn't get it pressed up this time because, it's a lot of money to press up, and I don't think because I'm not gigging, I wasn't confident that I could even sell 500, never mind 1,000, so I'm really doing it as a download only. But I think there's about 15, 16 tracks on it. There's a few cover versions, John Lennon's Instant Karma, a cover of a Roxy Music song, there's a cover of a Donovan song. Yeah. But there's a lot of my own stuff on as well. And Murder in the Park, there's a bit of a story behind that. That's an old song that I did in a band in the 90s I was in briefly called the Sky Daddies. We never gigged, we just sort of wrote songs. Yeah. And it was one of the best songs from that period. And so I did a new version of that, and it turned out really well.
Right. Well, in between the first and the second Fast Cakes album, you also did a reunion album with Bazak's, and... that was, about 2009, 10?
2010, yeah. I got in touch with Sav on Facebook, and it wasn't a planned thing. All of a sudden, he had a song called Disco Apocalypse.
Yeah, which I've heard, yeah.
And he sent that to me and said, do you want to do something with that? And I really enjoyed going to town on it. It was basically just 2-track guitar and vocal from Sav, and I put it onto my multi-track, did a keyboard arrangement and backing vocals and all sorts of things, and Sav really got into it, and we he just went from there. He said, well, send it to Jeff in Australia.
Jeff Fogarty.
Yeah, because Sav was in the Far East, and Jeff Fogarty, the sax player, was in Australia. Mick was still in Redcar. So we sent it to Jeff, and he put some stuff on it, and then Sav said, I've got another song. And within about 3 months, we had about 10 songs that we were pinging across the world. Yeah. And we suddenly realised we've got an album here. And the way Sav approached it was he was writing songs in the style of the 1980 Bazak's. And we were kind of putting a modern sheen on it. And it was the album that we never really made. It's as if we sort of went away for 30 years, come back together and actually decided to make an album. Yeah. And again, that's something I'm really proud of. I really enjoyed doing that. And so that was fun, yeah.
Yeah, I like Disco Apocalypse particularly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're nearly coming to a close now, John. We're going to hear one more track from you in a moment, but I like a sort of unofficial, or maybe it's an official quote of yours. I will always record new music as long as I have my health. Well, I say, long may you continue to do so. Before your final track, John, thanks very much for allowing me to host your personal TBA Local Hero podcast.
Yes, no problem. I'm sorry, it's a bit self-indulgent, but I thought I'd have one time this side of the room rather than asking the questions.
Well, I think it's been a fascinating and compelling listening experience, and I'm sure other people listening to it will agree too. Okay, to wrap things up, we're going to do your final studio session track.
Yeah.
Just tell us about this, and then let's give the people the opportunity to hear it.
It's called If It Ain't Fixed, Don't Break It. And it's basically, it's the way I write songs quite often is to literally turn the recorder on, put my fingers on the keyboards and see what happens. And quite often I've done whole backing tracks that ended up as being proper songs just off the top of my head. And I mean, it's not something that's very clever, but I do that as opposed to actually crafting a song and writing down the chords and doing everything piece by piece. This is one of those that is a sort of a half-finished idea, instrumental, that may at a later date become a more developed song, but at the moment it's just like a little tune at the moment.
Okay, well, we're going to hear it in a moment, but for now, thanks very much, John.
Thank you.